bits of Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness and called the light day, and the darkness she called night. Light, dark, day, night. Is that all we experience? Of course not. Genesis is giving us the black and white crayons, but we understand without having to think about it very much that in between light and dark, day and night, is a breathtaking and mysterious spectrum. We know about early dawn, just as a faint light appears on the eastern horizon, gradually growing until the spectacular moment when the sun is suddenly released from the horizon and the light is blinding. We know the wonder of a glorious sunset, followed by a soft and gradual fading of light before beautiful darkness sets in. And then moonrise, casting a soft glow over the landscape. A much bigger box of crayons. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together she called seas. And God saw that it was good. Earth, sea, water, dry land. Is that all we experience? No, of course not. Genesis is giving us the foundation, the black and white crayons. But we all know, without it having to be explained to us, that the creator of our jewel of a planet has given us swamps and wetlands. The truth is even embedded in the language, wetland. And estuaries and tidal flats, and streams that flood in parts of the year and are dry as a bone the rest. A breathtaking and mysterious spectrum, a bigger box of crayons. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. Plants, trees, seeds, fruit. Is that all? Of course not. Again, the writer of Genesis has given us the black and white crayons, knowing full well as they wrote it that every day of our lives, human creatures are aware of the explosion of plants and trees, fruits and seeds everywhere on earth, adapting to every geography and climate condition, from mountains to jungles to deserts, of every size, texture, and color. And flowers. Don't forget the flowers. A breathtaking and mysterious spectrum. A bigger box of crayons. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness." So God created humankind in their image. In the image of God, they created them. Male and female, they created them. The image of God, male and female. Is that all we experience? No. Genesis is giving us, once again, the black and white crayons. And certainly the colors of human beings are black and white and every imaginable and glorious shade in between. Such a breathtaking and mysterious spectrum. But is it possible that it might be more to the point to say that Genesis is giving us the pink and the blue crayons? What we have thought of as male and female. But is it possible that we are discovering yet another breathtaking and mysterious spectrum? Perhaps a bigger box of crayons than we ever imagined. For the beauty of the earth, for the glory of the skies, for the love from our birth, over and around us lies. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We're doing our best with the technology here to keep you all where you need to be. And I'm struggling to figure out how to get myself back on the screen here. Maybe our tech support person can help me out here. Leanne, can you spotlight me?
You are spotlighted, Dave.
Am I? Good.
We can see you.
Perfect. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Dave Ogilvie. Many of you have had communication from me, or you've met me on our previous events that we've held in the last little while, and it's really good to be able to be with you once again. I'm the chair of the program committee for the Gathering of Baptists. I am the minister of Burlington Baptist Church and in Ontario. And I like to remind people that my Baptist pedigree is pretty sound. Not only was my dad a Canadian Baptist minister, but my brother will be known to some of you in the West as your executive minister. And I've served Baptist churches in 5 provinces in Canada. So I like to think I know a little bit about what it is to be a Canadian Baptist. Let me tell you just a little bit about the overview for the day. You all received the outline for what was to happen today, and we're going to follow that as best we can, recognizing that our timeframes always have to be adjusted a little bit along the way. But our guest speaker will speak to us in just a couple of moments. There'll be a time for questions, and then a break, a short one, but an opportunity for you to stretch and grab something to eat or drink if you need to, and then come on back quickly because we've got a great panel discussion prepared, and I'll tell you more about that when we get there. Another opportunity to ask questions before we move on towards the end of our day. Asking questions is going to be a pivotal part of your experience. We want you to be able to feel that you can ask questions of our speaker and our speakers along the way. So in order to do that, you're going to need to get familiar with the chat function, which is in most cases at the bottom of your screen. By clicking on chat, you have an opportunity to send a message to everyone, or if you want to ask a question, you need to scroll through the list of participants till you find tech support. And our tech support person is Leanne, and she will receive your questions, and then she will direct those through me to the people who are speaking. As you can imagine, it's a bit of a challenge. We've got about almost 150 people on this meeting, which is absolutely wonderful, but it does make for some technical challenges, and we're going to do the very best we can along the way. If you were part of earlier events, you'll know that last September we had Dr. David Gushy with us to talk about his experiences of changing his mind in regard to his understanding of the inclusion of LGBTQ members in our churches. We moved on from that in October to a second event where we heard from queer folk in our midst who wanted to share with us their own experience, and we called that Hearing Queer Voices in the Church, and it was a wonderful opportunity to listen. We also realized afterwards that there was still more that we could do and needed to do, and we wanted to have a chance to provide some encouragement and resources to churches that wanted to embark on their own journey of learning and discernment. And we wanted someone that could speak to us to help us with that. And immediately, many of us thought of Cal Molina. The Reverend Dr Cal Molina is with us today all the way from Prince George, BC. Cal will be very well known to those of you in Western Canada because he has been an ordained Baptist minister in the West for over 35 years, having retired about 5 years ago now. He has served churches in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and BC, giving leadership, very effective leadership with the CBWC, that's the Canadian Baptists of Western Canada, for those that don't recognize the acronyms, and also serving as president of Canadian Baptist Ministries, our national mission organization. Cal is very well known, highly respected, and appreciated by so many of us. What his bio doesn't tell you is that he and I started out about 40 years ago on staff of First Baptist Church, Lethbridge, Alberta. We were the young Turks that were going to set the world on fire and show everybody how it was done. We're a little longer in the tooth now, but we like to think we still have something to contribute. I think one of the things that perhaps Cal has learned along the way is something that I learned, and that is that not everything I learned in Sunday school was gospel. Many of the things I learned in Sunday school had to be revisited and reinterpreted through the lens of my own experience. And Cal's going to share some of his experience over the years since. I'm not going to say anything more than that, other than to say that it is my delight to welcome Cal Molina as our keynote speaker today. Cal is indeed a trusted pastor, colleague, and friend. So Cal, welcome.
Thanks, Dave. I hope you all can hear me. I want to, first of all, just thank the Gathering of Baptists for this invitation to speak. And thank you all for also for gathering us around this cause of working toward the inclusion of LGBTQ folks in the church. Later in this panel discussion we're going to meet three pastors who have helped to lead their churches to the point of formally affirming and welcoming LGBTQ Christians into their congregations. And I am so looking forward to hearing about their experiences. For churches within our Baptist tribe to reach that point, I know, requires many discussions and many courageous allies who are willing to share their convictions, sometimes at great cost. I know something of that cost personally. When I shared that I had come to an affirming conviction as a CBWC pastor some 11 years ago, I had to step down as the pastor of my church. Soon after that, I was asked to resign from the board of the CBWC. And since that time, I've been generally blacklisted in our denomination. But I have absolutely no regrets. It has opened a world of new ministry opportunities for me, wonderful new relationships, new avenues of spiritual growth that I would have never have anticipated. But mostly it has allowed me to be a part of this cutting edge movement in the kingdom of God. And that is working for the cause of compassion and justice for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters who have lived under the stigma and oppression for too many years. And I can't think of anything more important or that I would rather do for the limited number of years that I have remaining on this good earth than to be involved in this movement. And I'm assuming that if you are in this Zoom room today, it is because you too, at some level, are involved in this movement. In both the CBOQ and the CBWC here in the West, our denominations right now, there are threats in them to banish member churches that have formally become affirming. If those efforts are successful, it would be flagging that any church members in the pews across these denominations who believe that God would bless a gay marriage, that they do not belong in the denomination. And if that is successful, then these actions would ensure that the continued exclusion of LGBTQ Christians in our denominations for the foreseeable future, and would squelch any meaningful mission of our denomination to the LGBTQ community. So these are critical times for us. But there are reasons to be optimistic. Recent polls in the US indicate that 27% of white evangelicals affirm gay marriage, which is significantly up over just 5 years ago. And the percentage is much higher in the younger demographic. So more and more evangelicals are changing their minds on these issues. People like you and I are going to have more opportunities in the next few years to make a case for LGBTQ inclusion. Some of you are in church leadership positions and will be a part of designing how your church will discuss and decide on these issues. And I hope that you will take hold of these opportunities, even as I know for some of you, there will be a cost, that you will educate yourself and be prepared to engage in this kingdom endeavor as God leads you and as the opportunities present themselves in your particular setting. Now, several years ago, I was asked to lead a workshop with a group of Presbyterian pastors on the topic of my journey to an affirming position. And in preparing that all-day workshop, I came across 5 questions which helped me organize my thinking of how I had come to my own convictions, but which I think might also be helpful as a template to how a church could plan to grapple through the LGBTQ issue. So here are these 5 questions. The biblical question: what does the Bible say about the issue, applying the best interpretive principles? Secondly, the theological question: how does the broader scope of Jesus' teachings inform the issue? Thirdly, the historical question: what have the Christians who come before us said about this issue, and what lessons have we learned from the past history of the church? Fourthly, the scientific question: what has science discovered about the phenomena of these sexual minorities? How common are they, and what might cause them? And fifthly, the experiential question: what is the testimony of the people who are directly impacted by this issue? Gay people and trans people, bisexual people, and the friends and family of these people. In my workshop, I tend to go through these over several hours, and it was terrible for me to contemplate how I could talk about them in any meaningful way in just 45 or 50 minutes. But I'm hoping that the broad overview I might give, accompanied with the resources that I'll introduce, will be helpful to you as you think about your church and how you might discuss these issues. So let's jump in. And I'm going to take them in reverse order. First, the experiential question: what is the experience of people who are directly impacted by this issue? I start here because it was actually testimonial evidence that first caused me personally to question my presumptions about homosexuality. 25 years ago, I was a pastor and a denominational leader who held to a traditional, non-affirming attitude towards homosexuality. I wasn't really informed about the LGBTQ sexual minorities. I never met really any gay people in my circles within my conservative evangelical church culture. Well, actually, of course, I probably had met some people who were gay, but they wouldn't have confided with me about their sexual orientation because of things that I had said from the pulpit. Without really studying the relevant scripture passages, I presumed that the Bible condemned all manner of homosexual behavior. I saw the gay activist agenda as a part of the wider threat of secular humanism to the Christian faith. In 1993, when the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission was preparing to add sexual orientation to those things for which a person could not be discriminated for, I was one of a small group of evangelical pastors from Saskatoon who met with Attorney General Bob Mitchell in his office to protest the change. Thankfully, he didn't listen to us, and sexual orientation was added to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code. The first seeds of doubt about my position did not come from reading the Bible, discussing theology, or examining science or history. It came from actually getting to know a couple of gay people and listening to their stories. They happened to be people in my congregation who were still in the closet, but because of accusations by third parties, were forced to come out to me. They were people who I already had respected for their spiritual gifts and for their faith. They were people I cared about. Those conversations planted in my mind for the first time the possibility that a person could be both Christian and gay. This took a much more personal turn in 2009 when 2 of our young adult children came out as gay to Joanne and I. We have 4 children, all who are now happily married. And some of you will already know Beth, who is out there, I think, somewhere in the Zoom room this morning. Hi, honey. Beth is our oldest, and from a young age had a remarkable faith, which has blossomed into a rich life of ministry and leadership. She has an MDiv from Regent College and currently co-pastors a new church in Vancouver, as well as being the community director of Generous Space. We have two lovely middle daughters who are straight, Rachel and Sarah. And then our gay son, Danny, is a physician and presently doing his residency in psychiatry in Vancouver. He is married to a successful actor named Kevin Vidal. Perhaps some of you in Ontario have seen Kevin, as he was the character Bob in the cast of the long-running musical Come From Away that was in Toronto for several years. We, of course, know our children intimately, literally from the moment they were born. We were there at their baptisms and witnessed their growth as sincere followers of Jesus Christ. When our gay son and daughter tell us that their sexual orientation is something that they experience as innate, that is, intrinsic to who they are, and not something they chose, and that their gay orientation is immutable, that is, something they can't change or would now not want to, we believe them. We have watched as they have met and fallen in love with wonderful partners. We have been at their side when they shared marriage vows of love and fidelity. We have observed their marriages to be just as strong and faithful and fruitful as those of our two straight kids. And this testimony has had authority in our understanding of the gay issue. Through my wife's and my engagement with Generous Space, we have rubbed shoulders with literally dozens and dozens of wonderful queer folks, and we've heard their stories, sometimes heartbreaking stories. We have attended huge gay Christian network conferences in the United States and worshiped alongside thousands of gay Christian trans people who have authentically testified that they love God and are followers of Jesus. My wife and I also helped to host a national online Generous Space support group for parents of LGBTQs. And each month we hear their parenting stories and their struggles with the churches that they attend. There are, of course, many variations of people's stories, but there are some common threads we hear from the gay kids who grow up in Baptist Christian homes. Often we hear of their story of growing up with a sincere childhood faith, but after puberty, they become aware of being different. Unlike most of their friends, they have crushes on the people of the same sex. These feelings of attraction are often accompanied with deep feelings of anxiety and guilt. They picked up along the way that gay is wrong. Often they beg God to change them. They strongly testify that they do not experience this attraction as something that they chose. Why would they, when it involves so much potential rejection? Eventually, they have the courage to come out to someone and eventually to their parents. There are some testimonies of unconditional love and support from parents. Then there are other heartbreaking stories of rejection by family, by Christian friends, by the church that they grew up in. There are some stories of attempts at counseling, some of this conversion and reparative therapy, of attempts to pray the gay away. After a period of struggle, they describe accepting that they are innately gay. They will always be attracted to the same sex. Somewhere along the way, most of these young people no longer find the church a safe place and leave, never to return. Eventually, most come out publicly, as there is less stigma today in society generally. Some gay Christians accept the conservative position that this means a life of lifelong celibacy for them. But like most other human beings, the majority of gay Christians eventually meet someone that they are attracted to and they fall in love. And of these, some believe that God blesses their love and it becomes integrated in their Christian faith, and they usually seek out an affirming church that accepts and includes them and recognizes their relationship. Those that believe that God would damn their love walk away from their faith and from Christian community. And on the extreme, there are just too many stories of homelessness, of depression and suicide, for gay young people who've been rejected from conservative evangelical homes and from their churches. In my opinion, the single most important thing we can do to change our church's mind is to have gay and trans and other queer Christians and their parents just tell their stories. How much authority does the testimony have in this debate? Now, some will write it off. Some have written me off. Well, he has a gay kid. His compassion for someone he loves has clouded his doctrine. Well, I would beg to differ. I think many people have had their compassion clouded by their doctrine. When we think of the biggest issue in the early church that had to do with inclusion, it of course had to do with Gentiles. There was a powerful stream of Jewish scripture and tradition that called on godly Jews to separate from Gentiles. Jews couldn't marry Gentiles, they couldn't eat with them, they couldn't even enter their homes. Gentiles were unclean, and circumcision was the mark of who was in and who was out. It is hard for us to imagine the kind of cultural and doctrinal walls that would have prevented a first century Jewish Christian from including and affirming a Gentile person in their church. Paul went out as a missionary to the Jewish diaspora, but found that while many Jews were resistant to the gospel, there were Gentiles who were becoming believers, wanting to be baptized and follow Christ. And Paul at some point went through a personal change of mind on these issues, and he resolved that Gentiles could become Christians equally in every way with Jews. And in the book of Acts, we have an account of the Jerusalem conference as the leaders of the church grappled with the issue of Gentile inclusion. And it's significant to me how much testimony played a role in that discussion. First Peter, who had received the vision of the sheep with the animals, if you remember, and where God told Peter, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. And now Peter speaks up at this conference and he says, God, who knows the heart, showed that he accepted these Gentiles by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. He did not discriminate between us and them, for he purified their hearts by faith. And then the whole assembly became silent as they listened to Paul and Barnabas telling about the signs and wonders that God had done among the Gentiles through them. Testimony was the powerful agent of change in this first inclusion issue in the church. And I believe it can be as well in ours. It is telling that in our denomination, the CBWC, as far as I know, in the last 20 years of discussing this issue from time to time, we have never heard from a gay person in the entire history of those discussions. I've left some testimony resources with you. I want to encourage you to see a video that's 47 minutes long called Through My Eyes, True Stories of Young Gay Christians. This is something you could use in your church that allows them to hear stories of several different kinds of gay people. Of course, it's best if you actually find a person, if you can, but the church is so unsafe for so many gay people sometimes, it's hard to do that. There are other videos on the Generous Space website of trans people and their stories. I personally love to listen to Gina Riccaro, who is a model, and she comes out as trans on a TED Talk that's on YouTube that you can download too. When it comes to books, I love the autobiography by Justin Lee entitled Torn, and Vicki Beeching's book called Undivided, Coming Out, Becoming Whole, Living Free from Shame. These resources will be on a list for you at the end of the talk so you can get them. Let's move on to the science question. Now, some fundamentalists treat science like the enemy, and other people's eyes just glaze over when you start talking about science. My first training was as a chemical engineer, and I have always been extremely interested in science. And I have a deep need to integrate what we are discovering from the natural world with my faith. And there will be others like me in your churches. One of the things that science can tell us is just how prevalent are the sexual minorities. The estimates these days are that 3 to 4% of the population are lesbian, gay, or bi, and perhaps 0.6% trans. One of the other things that science can tell us is to debunk some of the false theories of what causes homosexuality. Some of the earliest theories about homosexuality, of the psychosocial theories, have been now debunked by science. And one of those is that homosexuality is caused by parental dysfunction. And I know, talking to Christian parents, that very often parents ask themselves, did we do something wrong? You know, did we not get our kid boy to play with enough trucks? You know, he's turned out gay. Well, these have all been debunked scientifically. It is very hard to explain in mixed families like our own, where we have 4 kids with the same parenting, how 2 would end up gay and 2 end up straight. There are no scientific facts that parental dysfunction causes homosexuality. The other early theory was that homosexuality would have been caused by some early sexual trauma in a person's life. And some of these reparative therapies that we read about assume this, that in the person's childhood, they've had some kind of trauma, and you've got to dig that out. And once you figure it out, the kid can be healed and he can become heterosexual. Science shows that this is simply not true. There is, in many people's experience who are gay, they have not had any kind of early childhood sexual trauma. What science does show in their studies in the last 20 years is a growing consensus for a biological explanation for homosexuality. I know how some people have trouble just listening to science, but I'm going to give you a 5-minute overview, if I can, of what we have learned scientifically about this. If you remember back to your high school biology, you will remember that in conception, the mother's egg has the X chromosome. And in the father's sperm, there is an equal number of X and Y sperm. And so whichever one gets there first or is successful in impregnating the egg, we have XX becomes a girl and XY becomes a boy. And after this fertilization occurs, then this amazing miracle of the fetus growing, how the DNA that's been in the cells begins to be the blueprint for this entire life, how the organs start to develop. And in this XY chromosome part of our genome, that is what begins the sexual differentiation. And at one point in the development of the fetus, the Y chromosome triggers hormones which create testosterone and which create a male baby. And these traits then also have an effect on the brains. There's a masculine brain and a feminine brain. They are very similar, but also different in different ways. The triggers from our DNA mostly work through hormones, and we're all familiar with the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen. There are 2 key times in a human development when there is a flood of these sex hormones. One of them we all know very well. We call it puberty, and we've been through it. And it's an amazing process how in our young teens, there's this genetically triggered hormone experience where boys and girls develop their reproductive organs into maturity. But the other time is in gestation. And when the fetus is still developing, there is this particular period of development when there is a flood of testosterone and where the sexual differentiation occurs. And it is in this period where scientists are finding are the roots of sexual orientation. There is different reasons why there's diversity in this flood of testosterone levels during this key point that will determine whether a brain is wired for sexual orientation. In some cases, the genetic code itself may be the cause, and there's all kinds of studies in science that are trying to figure out this in a way that this is a source of sexual orientation. But most of the studies are pointing at the hormones themselves and how the mother's body contributes to a hormone mix when the fetus is in her womb. And they have many studies from various different angles that show that the hormone levels can be affected by a virus where there's an immune response during this time of fetal development, or some other reason why the hormones are different during this period of time. Now, for ethical reasons, science can't just manipulate these hormones to experiment on human beings to see if they put a little more testosterone in, whether this person's going to end up being gay or not. However, they've done these kinds of experiments on animals, and they've been able to manipulate the exposure of the fetuses to sex hormones during gestation, and they can induce lifelong male typical behavior and female typical behavior and same-sex behavior in animals. There are also human diseases and syndromes, which we know affect prenatal hormone levels, and these studies show correlations with this theory that sexual orientation is a result of hormones in this prenatal period. The bottom line is this, that science is verifying that what gay people testify is true, that their sexual orientation is not a moral decision they make after they're born, but it is something that is innate. It is biologically wired into their brains while they were still in their mother's womb. Getting a handle on the science question can be hard for churches, but I've come across one particular resource that I really enjoy. It is a documentary that was made by a Canadian filmmaker named Bryce Sage, and it's called Are People Born Gay? Bryce himself is gay, and he sets out on this search to find out what science says is why he's gay. It's an entertaining film. It is not heavily technical, and it's something I think would be very interesting to watch in a church setting and then have people break out and talk about it. It's 45 minutes long, and it's on YouTube. The best book on this topic is a book by the neuroscientist Simon LeVay. It's called Gay, Straight, and the Reason Why, The Science of Sexual Orientation. It is a heavy book full of all kinds of scientific studies. If you're into science and this is something you have to resolve, or you know a person who has to have these questions resolved, if they're going to change their mind on this issue, I would suggest you take the time to read that book. Rushing along, number 3, the historical question. We often confront opposition to an affirming position on the basis that it's something new, that it's not a traditional position, that it's not orthodox. It is true that the Christian church has traditionally been opposed to homosexual behavior, based largely on its interpretation of a few Bible verses and assuming that homosexuality was a moral choice. There are enough historical references to homosexuality to know that it is a broad human phenomenon cutting across ages and across cultures. As a small minority in a heterosexual world, homosexuality, for the most part, has been seen historically as a perversion and treated with stigma, punishment, and even death. There are only a few places and times in history where there has been acceptance of homosexual behavior. There's the third gendered person in some indigenous cultures in which it was given even special spiritual status. Another place where homosexual behavior was socially accepted is the Greek and Roman practice of pederasty, in which it was socially acceptable for an otherwise heterosexual male of privilege to also have a homosexual relationship with a younger man, often a slave. The understanding of a person having an innate same-sex orientation is relatively new in human history. The English word homosexual was only coined in the 1880s. Gay people historically have lived secret lives and often married the opposite sex just for social acceptance. If a gay or lesbian person revealed their orientation, they were subject to rejection by family, the church, and society. They were also subject to all kinds of discrimination and potentially imprisonment under sodomy laws. A classic example historically of this was the case of Alan Turing, made famous in the movie The Imitation Game. Turing was a brilliant mathematician known as the father of the modern computer. In World War II, he used his invention of the computer to break the Nazi coding machine called Enigma. This allowed the Allies to intercept all the Nazis' military messages. His incredible personal contribution to the outcome of the war is estimated to have shortened the war by 2 to 3 years, and thereby saved over 14 million lives. However, Turing was homosexual. His military contribution had to be kept secret after the war. In 1952, he was prosecuted for gross indecency for having a gay partner in his home. Faced with prison, he opted for chemical castration. through estrogen treatments. The treatments caused him to develop female breasts and clouded his mind. He committed suicide 2 years later in 1954. Because of the Official Secrets Act in Britain, Turing's contribution in the war was only revealed in just the last couple of decades. In 2009, the British Prime Minister made an official public apology on behalf of the British government for the, quote, appalling way that Turing was treated. Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous pardon in 2013. A 2019 BBC series, as voted by the audience, named Turing as the greatest person of the 20th century. And his picture is now on the new bank note, the £50 note in England. A study of church history shows that what has been accepted as traditional and orthodox by church and society has often been wrong and unjust, and has later been abandoned and apologized for. The argument then is that the church's traditional treatment of homosexuals can be in this same category. Let's just think of a couple of quick examples of how the church has got it wrong. Slavery. The large Southern Baptist denomination was founded on its support of the institution of slavery. It argued that slavery was biblical and ordained by God. Slaves, obey your masters as unto the Lord, Ephesians 6:5. This verse and a couple of others in the New Testament justified the atrocities of kidnapping Africans, shipping them like cattle in shackles in the hold of ships, selling them to slave owners, often separating parents from their children, and then forcing them to work in bondage in the cotton fields for the rest of their lives under the whip. All of this was justified by a handful of Bible verses and upheld as orthodox by Baptist churches. After a civil war and a long ongoing struggle seeking civil rights and that Black Lives Matter, only in 1995 did the Southern Baptist Convention formally apologize for its historic stand on slavery. But the Southern United States still grinds under the oppression of systemic racism as a consequence of the evil that was slavery. The oppression of women, traditional discrimination of women as the weaker sex, making them unfit for church leadership and ordained to be submissive to men, has been the tradition of the Christian faith over the centuries. Based on a handful of Bible verses, Paul saying, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man, rather she is to remain quiet. Many denominations, including the Southern Baptists today, do not allow women to be in the pulpit or on an elders board. We as Canadian Baptists do, but it should be pointed out that in doing this, we have diverged from the long historical tradition and from theological orthodoxy. Anti-Semitism. Martin Luther in the 16th century wrote a book called On Jews and Their Lies, referencing scripture such as the Jewish leaders mocking Jesus at the crucifixion. In that book, he called all Jews venomous beasts, disgusting scum, devils incarnate, and he suggested that they should be slayed. Years later, Hitler would use these writings of Martin Luther to justify the Holocaust. And anti-Semitic attitudes were also reflected in Baptist churches in our country in the 1930s and supported the making of anti-immigration laws against Jews that turned away the MSS St. Louis that was filled with Jewish refugees and came to Canada for rescue. Movies have been made of it called Voyage of the Damned. Not being able to land these refugees in Canada sent them back to Europe and to Nazi gas chambers. The embarrassing rejection of science. There have been many historical rejections of scientific discoveries by the church, based on Bible verses such as Ecclesiastes 1:5, which says the sun rises and the sun sets and hurries back to where it rises. The Catholic Church condemned Galileo for saying that the earth orbited around the sun. Threatened with being burned at the stake, Galileo was forced to recant his clear scientific findings. He had to sign a paper that said they were abjured, cursed, and detested. It wasn't until 1995 and after an investigation that lasted 13 years, that Pope John Paul II admitted that Galileo was right and the church was wrong and apologized. Well, bottom line, a study of the history of the church teaches us that the church has often got things completely wrong. Traditional interpretations of the Bible have often led to evil and injustice in addressing these other important issues. New scientific discoveries have sometimes changed the landscape and require a fresh look at Scripture. The traditional teaching of contempt for homosexuals is only the latest of these past injustices. For resources, I would recommend to you Dr. David Gushie's video called Ending the Teaching of Contempt Against the Church's Sexual Minorities. It's a YouTube video, it's 60 minutes long. It would be excellent to starting a discussion in your church on this topic. And I also enjoy David Gushie's book, After Evangelicalism, which gives a more recent history of our particular movement, of the evangelical movement, and some of the things that we've done. So I leave those with you. Well, let's finish with biblical and theological together. Now, obviously, churches, and especially Baptist churches, are going to want to examine and discuss what the Bible says about homosexuality. Central to studying the Bible are the practical issues of interpretation. As we've already said, verses from the Bible have been used to promote slavery, the oppression of women, racism, anti-Semitism, not to mention justifying war and even genocide. The Bible is an ancient collection of books of different genres, different original languages, and often strange cultural practices. Many times, these interpretive issues are ignored by evangelicals, who would like to pretend that the Bible is always consistent and is unambiguous. For example, one of our recent CBWC documents on Baptist beliefs states, "We affirm that the biblical pattern of marriage is the lifelong union of one man and one woman." I wonder what Bible that refers to. The patriarchs and the kings of Israel had multiple wives. Then there were their concubines, the wives that men had, but that didn't have legal inheritance rights. And then there was the practice of levirate marriage, where a man was legally obligated to also marry his brother's widow. Fundamentalists can hold a narrow view of interpretation, a strictly literal interpretation of the Bible, thinking that this is somehow the highest view. But I think that most Baptists in our tribe recognize that there are deeper issues of interpretation that have to be considered. There's the issue of trying to understand the original meaning of the ancient words in their languages and then how they should be translated in English. There's another interpretive principle about grasping the original historical and cultural context of a passage. Was its application for a particular historical situation or for all time? Then there's the interpretive principle that the Bible is a progressive revelation. We have an old covenant and a new covenant. The incarnation of God in Jesus represented a quantum leap in our understanding of God and what it meant to follow him. To interpret the Bible properly, we have to understand this evolution of God's revelation. There are interpretive issues then in all of the so-called clobber passages in the Bible when it relates to homosexuality. It is always necessary to study these passages and their issues in detail if our churches are going to make decisions about inclusion. I'm sure many of you have already studied these passages and perhaps read books about them. The best book I know that presents a clear and convincing affirmative perspective on the Bible passages is Matthew Vines's book, God and the Gay Christian, The Biblical Case in Support of Same-Sex Relationships. In this book and in others, you will find the arguments that each of the clobber passages has either been misinterpreted or is not relevant to the case of two innately same-sex oriented Christians who love each other and desire to make vows of fidelity to one another in marriage. I will just touch down on a couple of talking points on these passages to give the lay of the land, but have to leave it, of course, to you to do the real study. The sin of Sodom in Genesis chapter 19 was where the townspeople evilly, wickedly attempted to degrade these foreign visitors of Lot. In that historical context, this defied the hugely important cultural obligation of Lot to provide protection and hospitality to his guests. The extent of this obligation to his guests is shown by Lot's willingness, disturbingly, to sacrifice his two virgin daughters to the mob in their place. In the end of the story, God destroys the entire city for its wickedness. In the next 12 biblical references to the sins of Sodom that we find in the Bible, as it refers back to this event, they never refer to homosexuality as the sin of Sodom. Instead, it is the pride, arrogance, and cruelty of the city. Yet from this passage was coined the word sodomy, coined to refer to all homosexual activity. And this has resulted over the centuries in linking all homosexuals with this story of rape, violence, and God's exterminating judgment. This interpretation of the story of Sodom ranks as one of the great travesties of biblical interpretation, because it has resulted in untold acts of violence against gays over the centuries, even though the sin of Sodom had nothing to do with homosexuality. The abominations of Leviticus 18 and 20, which states that it is an abomination for a man to lie with a man as with a woman, and that both should be put to death. This verse is one of a long list of prohibitions and punishments in this Old Testament book of Jewish purification law. It has been singled out and applied to gay people in the 20th century, while the other abominations that are listed in Leviticus have been largely ignored. For example, touching a pig's skin is an abomination. So much for playing football. Other abominations deserving of death included children disobeying their parents, girls who engaged in premarital sex, but not the boys, interestingly, anyone who used the Lord's name in vain. In Exodus 25, working on the Sabbath day was a capital offense. And in Ezekiel, the death penalty was the punishment for charging interest on a loan. How can we justify the violence that has been directed towards gays based on these verses when we ignore the vast majority of the other laws in Leviticus and would never advocate for actually killing people who do them anymore, and at the same time claim a New Testament theology that declares freedom from the law? Paul's unnatural acts of Romans 1 highlights the moral depravity of Greco-Roman society in order to present Christ as the Savior in chapter 3. Chapter 1 talks about Roman sin, chapter 2 about the Jews who've also abandoned the way, and it sets up for Paul to talk about Christ in chapter 3. Because of their idol worship in chapter 1, Paul says God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. Paul goes on to say they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Now, we know from history that the privileged class in Rome had a reputation for unbridled sexual license, orgies, male and female prostitution, pederasty, bestiality, every imaginable act of voyeuristic sexual perversion we find in Greco-Roman society. It is always possible for humans to choose to commit unnatural sexual activities. But our modern concept of an innate sexual orientation was not identified or understood in Paul's day. Whatever is in Paul's mind about the unnatural sexual mores of the Roman world, he is not talking about my gay daughter and son, whose natural orientation is to be attracted to someone of the same sex. Paul is thinking of idol worshippers who deliberately engaged in same-sex relations out of voyeurism. They do what is unnatural to them. To clobber our Christian kids who grow up in our Baptist churches with this innate same-sex orientation, which they did not choose, and say to them, this is you in Romans 1. You have chosen to exchange the natural for the unnatural. This is you. You have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. You are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. You are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. You invent ways of doing evil. You have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Does that make sense? A proper interpretation of Romans 1 is that Paul is talking about a sexually depraved, pagan, Greco-Roman society. And it's not the young gay people that I know who love God and are followers of Christ. Finally, there's Paul's list of unrighteous behavior in 1 Corinthians and 1 Timothy 10. Included in these verses are the two words interpreted to be condemning of homosexuality. The two Greek words are malakoi and arsenokoitai, both of which have ambiguous meanings, but which modern English translators have sometimes translated as homosexual. Malakoi is a common word which meant literally soft. When used in a derogatory way for a person, it meant weak or womanly, and perhaps effeminate. The famous Roman general Pompey was called Malakoi by his detractors because he wanted to stay at home with his wife on one occasion rather than go to war. Malakoi was not synonymous with homosexual. The word arsenokoitai is a word that doesn't appear in any other Greek literature before Paul uses it. And so its meaning is very uncertain. We honestly don't know what Paul was referring to. Again, even if Paul was using these words to refer to some kind of homosexual behavior, there is still this argument that he would not have had any concept of a person with an innate same-sex orientation, but rather would have been aware of these exploitive practices of pederasty for which the Roman world was known. Well, if you haven't already, I would encourage you to do an in-depth study of the handful of passages which have been used against homosexuals, both to inform your own convictions, but also so you can participate in the discussions around these Bible passages in personal conversations and in your church's discussions. If you're using videos to initiate this in your church, I think that a video by Justin Lee called The Bible and Homosexuality, a Nuanced Approach is on YouTube. It's about 30 minutes long. A longer one by Matthew Vines is called The Gay Debate, The Bible and Homosexuality. It's about an hour long. It's also on YouTube. I need to close, so I just close with a few concluding remarks. There's one theological issue that I think also has to be put on the table when we discuss the Bible in our churches, and I will close with this. Several years ago, I was speaking with a Presbyterian pastor friend, and I asked him what his impression was of us Baptists. I will never forget what he said. He said that it seemed to him that the practical theology of Baptists was that Jesus died and left us a book. That Jesus died and left us a book. In his mind, Baptists were focused on studying and parsing the book, but ignored the living Christ as head of the church and his Spirit with us. Now, at the time, I wanted to defend my tribe, but I think there's some truth in what he said. Have we subtly replaced God with a book? Is Baptist faith about a personal relationship with the living Lord Jesus and the infilling of his Spirit, or is it about a book? I referred earlier to the new CBWC statement of faith that we are considering, and it has a common statement about Scripture in it as part of the statement of faith. It says, we believe in the divine inspiration of Holy Scripture and its entire trustworthiness and supreme authority in all matters of faith and conduct. I recently came across the foundational doctrinal statement of the Baptist Union of Great Britain, and it's an interesting comparison to our statement. Their statement says this: our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, God manifest in the flesh, is the sole and absolute authority in all matters pertaining to faith and practice, as revealed in the Holy Scriptures. And each church has liberty under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to interpret and administer his laws. What is the highest authority for a Baptist? I believe it is Jesus Christ. The scriptures are certainly important because they recorded what Jesus did and what he taught us and when he walked on the earth. And now the living Lord Jesus leads us as head of the church and through his indwelling Holy Spirit. When we grapple with how to think about LGBTQs and gay marriage, we first, I believe, must go to Jesus. All parts of the scripture are not equal for me. I'm one of those red letter Christians. The teachings of Jesus really are the very word of God, and they supersede the Levitical law and the letters of Paul that he wrote to the churches. Of course, Jesus didn't say anything directly about homosexuality, which should already tell us a lot. It was not a central issue for Jesus. But in the big picture, what did Jesus teach us? More than anything, Jesus taught us to live by the love principle, to love God with all our heart and mind and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. All the other laws, Jesus said, hang on these two. His example of loving our neighbor as ourselves was the Good Samaritan, this story of compassion and practical acts of kindness of the Samaritan to a person who had been beat up and left by the roadside, while the religious types walked by on the other side. Over and over again, we see Jesus reaching out in love and grace to these outcasts in Jewish society, the poor, to women, including prostitutes, divorcees, and adulterers, to lepers and cripples who were not allowed to be in the temple. That should tell us something about who Jesus felt was important to reach out to. And who did Jesus criticize the most? The self-righteous rule keepers who pointed their finger and judged others. And it was them who would eventually plot to kill Jesus, in part because he was a friend of the outcast. As a follower of Jesus, on the one hand, I look out at the sexual minorities in our world who have been treated as the lepers of our day, literally denied membership in our churches. And on the other hand, I see the religious types who attack them as sinners and exclude them, who condemn them to celibacy based on a few verses in the book. And I ask myself, as one who wants to be a follower of Jesus, who is the living Lord of my life and the head of the church, who has absolute authority in all matters of faith and practice, I ask, how does Jesus want me, on the one hand, to treat these gay people and to understand how to treat those who criticize them? And for me, it is a no-brainer. I just have to come down on the side of radical love and acceptance and stand against those who would judge and oppress them. I hope if some of you feel the same, that it will make you courageous to be involved in this discussion, whether it be in one-on-one conversations or in trying to help your church change its mind in a more formal way. And may God help us and bless us as we engage in this important kingdom work. Thank you.
Dave, unmute.
Thank you, tech support. Cal, thank you very much for all you've shared with us. You've certainly given us lots to think about and lots that I think we'd like to respond to. And so I'd just like to remind you that if you'd like to ask Cal a question, you go to the chat function and scroll through till you find Cal's name, or till you find tech support, and you can direct your question to Cal through tech support. I'm going to reach out to our tech support, to Leanne at this time. And Leanne, have you got some questions for us to consider?
Well, in actual fact, I only have one. So I invite you to send your questions. So this one is from Ryan. And he asks, how do you respond to people when they say, I'm okay with gay Christians, but I put them in the same category as divorced Christians? This is ultimately not God's perfect plan or will for them. Of course, I'll let them be a part of the church, just as we do with divorced persons, but I lament that they too have not been able to experience God's perfect will or plan for their lives. Over to you, Cal.
Well, we can think of gay people as somehow crippled. And when I referred to them as maybe being similar to lepers, I think of it more in terms of their being condemned than it is that being gay is some kind of a disease. In my conversations with gay people, many of them do not feel like they are a broken version of the human family. They believe that they are on a spectrum of diversity in the human family. They do call themselves queer often, that they know they're different, they're this minority, but they kind of embrace the rainbow idea that there's just different colors in the crayon box, and they therefore celebrate their difference. They don't see it as some kind of a liability that puts them in this category of somehow not being fully human. And so I suppose, I suppose I've adopted that perspective too. And I think that the book I quoted by Vicki Beeching is especially directed more toward young women, because Vicki is a lesbian and she writes in that tone, but she writes very much trying to help young girls to accept themselves and to understand themselves as not broken human beings, but to believe they can have as full a life in God as any other person could have. So I guess I would argue with people a bit on that point, Ryan. I think if you actually hear the stories and get to know these gay people as real people, you are less likely to sort of come to that conclusion about them and to treat them in any way as less than fully human.
Thank you, Cal.
I think I'm going to chime in, if I may, too, tech support.
Go ahead, Dave, sorry.
On now.
Calling me in, it's okay.
Sorry, Leah. I find that question an intriguing one, partly because as a divorced person, I identify with it on that level. And this idea that somehow some are whole while others are broken is, I think, something that I'd want to challenge as well. That somehow in the church there are those who are whole and complete and all right, while others of us are somewhat less than that. I think I'd want to challenge that. I don't know how you feel about that, Cal, but.
No, we're all broken.
Yeah.
Just in different ways.
Thank you. Leanne, do you have another question?
I do. Just give me half a sec here. So the next question comes from Nancy, and she says, can you share, Cal, more about your children's reactions, all four of them, to your and your wife's response to their coming out?
Well, we have a very close family, and our children are close to each other, which isn't always the case. And so they felt more comfortable talking to each other before talking to us. And so they had conspired. And I don't think they were too nervous about speaking with us, because I'd already had some experiences and it was changing my mind on this issue. But they came out to us about the same time. And I was actually in Africa with CBM when my poor wife first had my son come out to her. So she had a couple of weeks by herself before I came home, and we talked about it. And it was different with both with Danny and Beth, because Beth is so mature in her faith and had been so thoughtful through her seminary training, that we really trusted, kind of her to work it out with her. But Danny was younger. He had just started going to the Canadian College of Performing Arts as an acting student. And we asked him if he wouldn't come home from Victoria to Saskatoon. And we watched this video together called Doesn't the Bible Say?, which was about parents reacting to their kids coming out to them, 4 different parents. And it was a very helpful video for us to then kind of unpack together with Daniel, that opened up a conversation for us to just talk about what it's like for parents to hear their kids do this and what our feelings were, but to also just assure him that we loved him and nothing was going to change that. And so I think compared to many of the stories that I've heard from parents in our parent support group, we had it quite easy. Our kids didn't respond to their own coming out by having a lot of issues of drug addiction or sexual license. They came out to us on their side, being sensitive and trying to anticipate that might be something we would need some adjustment to. And I think we on our side, we're also fortunate to have a close family that we just felt immediately that we would surround them with love and not judgment. So I don't think we're as typical as some families, but that was the way it was for us. Did I answer your question? And Rob, why don't you come in and make it right after I say things? You just come in and correct things, okay?
Okay. So the next question, where'd it go to? The next question is from Aaron. What would you say to a church that has been dragging its feet on this issue, trying to walk a line between affirming and not affirming, not really coming down on either side?
Well, it probably describes most churches. The reason I left this pastorate, it was not because I was fired, but because I felt that it was going to be too divisive for the church, that we were too, there were certainly some people who probably leaned towards being inclusive and affirming, but then there was others who had never thought about it and had a very traditional conservative approach. And I was kind of forced to be honest because we were reconsidering my contract and I didn't want to stay in the church without having told them where I'd come down on this issue. So I forced the issue a bit on them by simply revealing my convictions. And so, we were one of these churches that hadn't really talked about the issues enough to really explore it. And it was very divisive. So I think that for churches to be somewhat on the fence is for starting to say that's not unusual, and that's going to be the case probably in many churches. And so I think we'll find out from our panel that it really is months or even years that churches talk about this issue before they feel they can have enough consensus to move toward a vote without it being really divisive for the congregation. Now, I think there is also a scenario where churches kind of decide that they'd rather stay in the middle, never really talk about it because they don't have any gay people anyway. So why divide over something? And so they just sort of say, well, everybody can believe what they want and we are just going to continue, to be united in love for each other and be a fellowship. However, what that does, though, is never really open your church to the possibility of having gay people who are going to feel comfortable with you. And if you actually end up with a gay person who does come into your fellowship and then the issue is forced, could they be a member? Could they be in leadership? You have not resolved that issue. And it will become then something you're going to have to decide on one way or the other. And so just sitting in this position of never talking about it to make any kind of real decisions about it, I don't think is very satisfying. And a lot of parents of gay kids end up leaving churches like that because they they don't want to have a church that their child would not feel safe in. And certain churches who are sitting on the fence in that way are not safe places for gay people to actually be able to be part of the community.
Thank you. There are a couple of others who are asking basically the same question, so I think you have answered those well. Roland says, the biblical tradition regarding Jesus seems to be somewhat ambiguous with respect to accepting outcasts because it includes people whom he called not to sin anymore. So how do you address that aspect of Jesus' apparent practice?
Yeah, well, that was addressed, of course, the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. And I think that sin is still real. And so it's not that by being inclusive of gays that we do not have morality. And I think David Gushy talks about this, and I realized that I agreed entirely when I had done my workshop years ago, that I'm really quite conservative about my sexual ethics. I believe in the idea of chastity before marriage, and I believe in fidelity after marriage. I think these are important spiritual principles that Jesus also agreed with. And I would call on gay people as much as straight people to follow those principles. So it's not that we go soft on things that are harmful and hurtful. I mean, adultery breaks relationships and hurts people. So yes, it's a sign of brokenness. But the key issue is that does God consider it a sin for a same-sex oriented person who has this innate orientation to have love and a marriage with somebody else? And I say, no, that's not. I believe Jesus would not call that a sin based on what I understand of the issue. And so he did not say that, for example, to the leper, because it wasn't the leper's fault that they had leprosy. That was the condition that person had, or the cripple. Those were physical ailments, but they were not something that person is morally had made a sin about. So I would say that this would be in the category, this is a genetic hormonal condition. This person did not choose this. It's not a moral decision. So I don't believe Jesus would consider it in the category of sin. A gay person, though, certainly can sin. They could commit adultery. They could be unfaithful too. And Jesus would say to them, go and sin no more as well.
Oh, Leanne, we can't hear you now.
Thank you. I just wanted to let you know that there are lots of questions coming in, and how would you like us to proceed?
I see by our agenda for the day that we're pretty much, we've actually moved a little bit beyond the time that we had allocated for this. I'm really encouraged that there are so many questions. So maybe we can kind of hold on to those for the time being. Maybe we can pass some of them along to Cal after as well. And there may be an opportunity during the second part of our morning too to address some of those questions. So I think I'm going to move us along for now, if I may. Cal.
Okay, so I will, I've copied and printed out all of the questions. So with the name of the person who asked the question, so they won't be lost. Those of you who took the time to ask a question, thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. And Cal, thank you once again for all you've shared with us today. Not only there's all kinds of information in there, and I think really valuable information, but you shared an awful lot of yourself. A lot of this was very confessional, and that takes some additional courage and generosity on your part. We want to say thank you very much, and we hope that you'll stick around for the second part of our morning, because I think we may want to come back to you for some further insight if you're willing to do that.
Well, please don't come back to me, because we've got 3 others that I really want to hear from, but I am going to stick around. I wouldn't leave at all. So yes, thank you for the opportunity, Dave.
That's right. Thank you, Cal. As promised in our agenda for the day, we're going to take a break. It's going to be a quick one. We're going to limit it to 5 minutes because we've got lots of other important things we want to share with you and some great people that we want you to hear from. So take a quick 5-minute break. According to my watch, it's 2:28. So that would be 2:33. We will reconvene with our panel. See you soon. I think we're going to reconvene very shortly. I hope you'll come back and join us.
Dave, it's fine to give out my email address.
Oh, thank you, Cal.
Dave, my wife just told me that I referred to generous space without really saying what it was because I just kind of assumed people would know, but I don't know. Somebody maybe if they
Just
maybe everybody did know.
Just sending out a quick note. Yes, welcome back, everybody. I trust that you've all had a chance to do a quick stretch. Zoom has so many benefits. We're able to connect across country for this, but it becomes a little wearying after a while too. So I hope that you've had just enough of a break to feel refreshed and that you're back here again. Cal mentioned to me a moment ago that he had made reference to Generous Space Ministries. And if you don't know about Generous Space, you need to. Cal's daughter, Cal and Joanne's daughter, Beth Carlson Malena is one of the staff located in Western Canada for an organization that's actually based in Mississauga here in Ontario, and is a great resource to congregations that are looking to have this kind of conversation. They have all kinds of great resources as well for queer folk in your congregations that are looking for a place to connect. And if you want to know a little bit more, the event that we did last October, which is available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, it featured a partnership between the Gathering and Generous Space. And the keynote speaker for that event is Beth. And there are other staff members and members of Generous Space Ministries that are part of that event as well. So I encourage you to take a peek at that too. When the planning committee began preparing for this, what we felt we needed to do was a couple of things. We wanted to provide some really important information from a trusted source, and Cal has done that so effectively for us this morning. But we also wanted to provide some examples, some models of churches who have done the hard work of learning and discernment on this important issue. As Cal suggested earlier, it's not an easy process. It's hard work for congregations to take this on. And because it's hard work, I think it's fair to say that most congregations simply avoid it like the plague. However, there have been churches, Baptist churches here in Canada, that have taken the lead and given us a path to follow. And so we're going to meet three people from three different churches in three different parts of the country this morning. And I'm going to chime in too, because you'll understand why I'm a fourth member of this panel. But first, I'd like to introduce you to the Reverend John Boyd. John is also fairly recently retired. Well, it seems recently, but he might tell you that it's been a little while now. John is retired after having served for, John, I think it's almost 30 years as the senior minister of First Baptist Church Halifax, I believe.
27.
27, there you go. And through those many years of leadership, John and the congregation of First Baptist Halifax really were the pioneers in this important initiative, I think, for as an example to so many others of us. So I think I'm going to start on the East Coast today. We're going to welcome John to our panel, and I'll introduce the others as we go. But John, welcome, and thank you for being here to share not only your own experience, but the example and the experience of First Baptist Church Halifax. Can you tell us a little bit about your and their story?
Do you really want a little bit, Dave, or do you want the full meal deal?
Well, we've only got so many hours, John.
I know. As Dave says, I'm from Halifax. I retired in 2015. I had a very eventful time as the senior minister in First Halifax from 1988 till 2015. So it was partway along that journey in the fall of 2003 that First Halifax began a process that led to a decision in 2006 that was basically against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in all aspects of church life. And it was supported at that time by a 93% in favor vote. So what prompted us to get involved in this journey? You might remember that at that time in the early 2000s, the country was moving toward legalizing same-sex marriage. And I, along with the deacons of the church, felt that the unwritten but prevailing don't ask, don't tell approach to homosexuality would not be sufficient, especially if a gay couple came to us asking for marriage in the church. Would it be at that moment that we would try to figure out where we stood? The consensus was that it would be better to prepare ourselves for that eventuality. Our denomination, at the same time, what was then called the Convention of Atlantic Baptist Churches, has a new name now, had joined with the CBM and the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada and others in a public campaign against same-sex marriage in favor of biblical marriage. Resolutions were passed at the annual assembly opposing the homosexual lifestyle, as it was called, as well as opposing the government's entrenchment of sexual orientation in the Federal Human Rights Code. These actions disturbed many in our congregation, that is, the actions of convention, and especially many of, though not all of, the deacons. There was a strong feeling, though, that First Baptist was being branded as narrow-minded and anti-gay by the denomination's actions and by the biblical literalism of their approach, and many in my congregation were upset with that. In some ways, it was a unique congregation among the other Baptists in Halifax, let alone Nova Scotia, and had long championed unpopular positions within the denomination, such as ecumenism, open membership, progressive theology, women in ministry, those sorts of things. And for more than a century, the church had formally embraced more liberal interpretations of Scripture. Demographics included many with multiple degrees in various fields. Some had very strong pro-gay views. I was among those who were appalled by the denomination's stance and actions and had spoken against them often from the pulpit and at denominational meetings. So in the fall of 2003, the deacons decided to create an educational series to prepare the church for an eventual vote on whether they would be an affirming congregation. This decision was framed for the congregation as seeking the mind of Christ, a theological frame. We weren't just trying to sort ourselves through a minefield in the community or in the denomination. Our heart desire was to know the mind of Christ, and in that, to know who we were and how we would live. The series that was prepared took place in the spring of 2004. It took us a while to get ready for that. and happened over 4 successive Wednesday nights. I was interested in Cal's 5 questions because we kind of stumbled into the same sort of areas. We invited a person that we knew who was a professional educator, high school principal, who also had a theological degree, to be our facilitator. He knew the best ways of doing adult education. And so he came to us each Wednesday night from a couple hours away and organized our meeting space and exactly how things would happen, developed the rules of engagement that people would use, put us all at card tables of 4, put the rules of engagement on the tables, and invited us into a journey and into a conversation that would be marked by such things as confidentiality. What you hear at your table stays at your table unless you have the permission of others. Marked by respect for one another, truly listening to one another, hoping to find in that experience of conversation a development of the mind of Christ in us. All views that were to be expressed at those tables were to be your own, not somebody says, but rather how you feel. The first night we had a medical doctor speaking about homosexuality from a scientific point of view. The second session involved a panel discussion with 5 gay and lesbian people who were associated with the local metropolitan community church. Each of them spoke of their personal experiences being gay in the church and how this had forced them, for the most part, to leave their denominations of origin. I think that particular night was the turning point in the experience. As Cal says, personal experience does a lot to open up people's hearts and minds. The third session involved a constitutional lawyer. Again, at this time, these issues were in front of us as community and as nation. And people had a lot of questions like, why can't gays be satisfied with common law relationships instead of demanding marriage? Why do they have to take our word, marriage? Our speaker, a woman who was absolutely marvelous in her way of expressing herself, not only answered our questions, but she had some of her own, and these too stuck in my mind. Why are churches the most likely organizations to seek exemptions from human rights legislation? And why do followers of Jesus want the legal right to exclude and discriminate? The final and fourth session of our event was entitled Reflecting Biblically and Theologically on Same-Sex Marriage. Our lay leader, our educator, gave his views from a layperson's perspective, and I presented on how the Bible could legitimately be read and interpreted to favor full inclusion of gay persons in the church. We used a questionnaire at the beginning of these 4 sessions that asked people to indicate where they felt they could spot themselves on a continuum that began with the view that homosexuality is a sin condemned by God and the Bible, all the way through to the view that homosexuality is a gift from God for the blessing of all of us and all creation. There were about 7 or 8 gradations on that continuum. That same questionnaire was also distributed after the last session, and we were very interested to see what happened. And people honestly put their views on that questionnaire, and it was clear that those in attendance, every person in attendance, had moved along the continuum from where they started. And some of them had moved a long way. Now, those sessions formed the background for continuing conversations as things moved quickly in both the wider community and in the denomination. In September 2004, same-sex marriage became legal in Nova Scotia. A Tory government did that. I was grateful. In the summer of 2005, the federal government passed the Civil Marriage Act, legalizing same-sex civil marriage across Canada while assuring religious bodies that their clergy would not be forced to officiate. If I had heard one more time at convention meetings that the government was going to force us clergy to marry same-sex couples, and if we refused, we'd go to jail, I thought I would scream. But that was the tenor of the conversations back then. That fall, the Convention Council declared that any clergy on their lists who officiated at same-sex marriages would have their names removed from the provincial registries for conducting marriages. In June of 2006, First Baptist Halifax was prepared to take a formal decision, which became a vote against various forms of discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation, in all aspects of church life, including sacraments, marriage, membership, and ordination. A few months later, the convention codified its opposition to gay marriage in its regulations on the ministry, calling it professional misconduct, and that would lead to the withdrawal of accreditation. So that was the journey that we took up until 2006. People have asked me about the outcome. The first outcome was enormous relief. I don't think people realized that they were carrying such a heavy burden in being part of that conversation and worrying about what people would think, what people would say, what would happen with the church split, all those things. And then it happened, and then it was over, and so for the first while, it was just relief. And then began a process of driving that belief deeper into our consciousness, our soul, and our practice. And one of the ways that happened for us was by getting involved with a Halifax-based youth project, as it was called, for gay young people. And they were doing camping programs in the summer for gay people, gay youth, and they were trying to develop gay straight alliances through the high schools throughout Nova Scotia. So we decided that we would help fund that. We made a major contribution to their province-wide seminar or gathering on developing gay straight alliances, and we made another major contribution towards their summer camping program. And on the brochures that the Youth Project developed for this, they of course listed us as sponsors, which drew a tremendous amount of attention, some of it negative and thankfully much of it positive. While I was still in office, I conducted only one same-sex wedding. Again, putting the lie to what I had often heard at convention, that gay people would be beating down our doors, demanding that we marry them. I don't know why gay people would ever do that. They did not look to Baptist churches as places of safety. In any case, I only conducted one. I conducted one after I retired, one for my daughter and her spouse. And I believe there's been at least one other by the current minister and maybe more. We now have an openly gay deacon in the congregation who is also a candidate for ordination through the CABF. More has taken place, but I think that's enough to give the flavor that the congregation is trying to live into the decision that they made and that they are feeling very comfortable about it. We did, in the end, leave the convention. 2011 refused to sign on to a new constitutional arrangement. And I eventually as well resigned my accreditation from the convention, and in large part because as I was going through the process of being investigated, my lawyer asked me the question, John, why do you want to be on a list that requires you to discriminate? And I just realized in that moment I didn't want to be on that list anymore. And so I withdrew from it. And thankfully, we were able to make other arrangements so that I could consider continue in full ministry. We also were kicked off the pension plan and the health plan, and we had to come up with alternatives for that as well. So what have we learned, or what have I learned? One thing I learned is that we need to give people the hermeneutical tools for studying the Bible. Fundamentalists and conservative evangelicals lead with the Bible and often intimidate the members of progressive churches who have not been given the tools to answer back. We need to frame our work theologically, as Cal said, show how this is acting faithfully as followers of Jesus Christ, as part of our Baptist distinctives, to follow how Christ leads. We need to prepare our people that our denominations are unlikely to be persuaded and what those consequences may mean. We need to do our homework on what people and congregations and leaders and ourselves, what we fear, and then deal with those fears and find ways to address what is holding people back. And we need to network like we're doing today. And I'm deeply grateful to the gathering for making this conversation possible. I'll leave it there, Dave. Might not be the full meal deal, but it's probably more than enough to chew on.
You gave us a good start, John. So thank you very much. And thank you for the leadership that you've given in this area. I'll say a little bit more about that later, but I, for one, am grateful for that. As we move across the country, we're going to touch down in Toronto next. I want to introduce you to Rachel Brooks. Rachel is the worship pastor at Danforth Church in Toronto. And see if I can find you, Rachel. There you are, right there. And Danforth Church, as with First Halifax and others who have taken this step, has faced some criticism and some pushback. It's not always been an easy banner to wear, to be welcoming and affirming. But Rachel, we thank you for joining us today too, and sharing a little bit of your story, and again, the story of Danforth Church. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Good, all right. Thanks, Dave, and thanks to the gathering for inviting us to be part of this. As Dave said, I'm from Danforth, and I'm really representing the three of us who lead at Danforth, and that's Lynn Marsh, Kirsten Trishal, and myself. I think Lynn and Kirsten are all here, so I can't see them, but I trust they're here. So we are so happy to be a part of this. For us, I think becoming affirming has just become such a core part of who we are as a church. It's really part of our identity. I think one of the things we want more than anything else is just to be a safe place for people who are LGBTQ to be able to come and worship in a way that they would identify as evangelical and even charismatic in our case. So I think there's a lot of churches that are very gay friendly. There are a lot of churches that are evangelical, but there's not too many that kind of cross that border. And we really want to be that safe place. And really doing something like this just feels like an extension of our call, which is why we're just so incredibly grateful. And I feel quite emotional saying that already. So yeah, it's a very big deal for us. So a little bit of background as to how we started our process. We'd had conflict over this issue in the past. We'd had a gay couple who had gotten married elsewhere, and let's just say there was a diversity of response in the congregation. We knew it was a big issue, obviously, for the whole church, so we would have to address it at some point. But I think the key thing, the precipitating factor that really kind of gave us that extra little push to start our process was thinking about our neighborhood, our community. And we were starting to ask questions as leaders about what were the impediments to really reaching our community. There were a number of things, but one of them was our stance on LGBTQ issues, or actually the fact we didn't have a stance. We minister in a community that's pretty left-leaning, really big on social justice. So, gay rights would be a huge thing. So we knew we had to kind of address this. And just to say, we weren't trying to come up with a theology to keep the neighbors happy, but we did know we had to be clear on this issue and give a good reason for why we believed what we believed. So that's really what started us off. We started to talk about this in 2010. We finished in 2015, so it was a long process, 5 years. We didn't plan for it to be any particular length. We just wanted to see it unfold. But I would say timing was important in the sense that we really wanted to let the process breathe and have space. We knew, people wouldn't change quickly. We didn't want to pressure people. So at every stage, we allowed, weeks, if not months, between different elements of what we did. We actually took a year, I think, after announcing we were going to do this and explaining that. I think it was a year before we actually really started the process, just to give people time to get their heads around the idea of even doing it. And then the place we started, and I think for me, this is probably the most important thing, and it kind of fits with some of what Cal has shared and John as well. We decided very intentionally not to start with the biblical passages. We decided to start with people and stories. We used the resource that Cal mentioned, the video Through My Eyes, which is now available for free on YouTube, which is very convenient. It's about 45 minutes. So we played half of it one Sunday, then we waited and we played the other half a few Sundays later. We had discussion after each meeting. And it's a very powerful video. It's the stories of about 20 or so young gay Christians about what it was like for them growing up in the church, realizing they were gay, coming to terms with that, coming out, and just the pain, the suffering, the rejection, the abuse, the confusion that kind of they were met with. It was very, very kind of gut-wrenching in many ways. And I think for us, it helped get rid of a bunch of stereotypes. And probably the most important one was the stereotype that would say that being gay is a choice. And I think a lot of people in our community thought that at the time. And I don't think there's any way you could watch that video and end up thinking being gay was a choice. It was a nightmare for these people. So just being confronted with that was just so powerful. So that was kind of where we started. The next thing we moved on to was looking at the Bible, looking at the clobber passages. And again, we did this over 2 separate Sundays. We had discussion after both. We left time in between those 2 Sundays. And our approach to the biblical text was really just to try and lay out different interpretations. We didn't try and convince people or say this is right or this is wrong. We said, here's the traditional understanding of these, traditional evangelical understanding of these texts. But here are some other interpretations. We used Matthew Vines as well as many other things. We talked about cultural context. We talked about language. We talked about the dangers of kind of importing 21st century assumptions into ancient texts, but we didn't try and convince people. We just laid it out there. We had discussion, and we just kind of gave time for these things just to sink into people's consciousness and hoping that the kind of change was happening. I think another thing I want to say, and this was important, is that throughout everything we did, we tried, and this was hard, but we tried to maintain a posture of what Generous Space calls generous spaciousness, which is very hard to say. But it's this idea that you don't judge people. You allow people to wrestle with the issues, to explore things, to be honest about where they're at, even if that's not popular, to disagree, without being excluded, without being marginalized, knowing that they're still part of our community, even if maybe they're the only person that sees something a certain way. It's just really important that people feel that, I think, so that they're in a safe place to kind of really examine things. And that I personally found that very hard. I think when you're passionate about something and you're convinced it's important and it's a justice issue and people's lives are at stake, I think trying to maintain that posture is very difficult, particularly when you're confronted with people, and we had some that just, they won't even engage with some of the things. We had people that just wouldn't even think of different interpretations of scripture, even though we'd laid them out. It was just, no, the Bible says. So I think trying to maintain that posture was a challenge, but just critically important. Couple of other things that we did that were very important and helpful to us is we, as leaders, we met with a group of LGBTQ Christians in Toronto. And again, we just listened to their stories, and it was so moving and so heart-wrenching. And we were just asking them, what do we need to do? What's the best way for us to become a safe place? And it was always, listen to us, hear our stories, get to know us before you judge us. And I remember one, the trans woman, saying, protect us. And they had experienced so much hate, so much abuse. I think that was just like got to my heart to saying, protect us. Well, why is the church not the ones protecting these people rather than causing so much suffering and so much damage? So that was really impacting, speaking to that group. Also, we met with Generous Space, fantastic organization. Hi, Beth, if you're out there. We met as leaders with Wendy, Beth, and Denise. And then Beth and Denise came and spent a Sunday morning with us, which was amazing. They shared their stories, they answered questions. And just such an amazing opportunity for our members to have that, like a really non-threatening space to ask people all the questions they had. So that was just a really, really, really helpful session. So those are, I think, some of the things that we did in terms of trying to educate our congregation and ourselves. But we came to a point where we felt like it was time to try and make some kind of statements and see if we could come to some consensus as a community about where we were at. So we kind of wrote something that the final version is on our website, which you might have seen or heard about. Apparently it got quite popular with a few negative people at one point, so you might have heard about that, but the final statement is there. Well, we came up with it together as a congregation, and as we discussed it, it became kind of clear to start with that a lot of our statements was really things we could all agree on, seemingly non-controversial things. Things like God loves everyone, God welcomes everyone, God is justice, LGBTQ people have been discriminated against and suffered greatly at the hands of the church, and a whole bunch of other things that just seemed like we could all agree on. The piece that was more controversial and people could not agree on was the idea of having gay, trans, bisexual people in leadership. That was the sticking point. So because of that, we decided to separate our statement out into the kind of first 6 points and then the controversial 7th point. I have to say at that point, all hell erupted in our congregation. And it wasn't really because actually of that. It was another conflict that kind of came upon us that was very ugly, very long, just awful in so many ways. And it really derailed our process. We did manage to vote on the first part of our statement, the kind of non-controversial part, but that became controversial because of the other conflicts. We had a vote, and whereas it should have kind of passed easily, it passed by a razor-thin margin. It all came down to one abstention, which was a nightmare. And then after that, we really had to just turn our attention to the conflict, so everything went on hold. When we came back to things, when the dust had settled from all the conflicts, a lot of people left. But those of us who remained, the core group that remained, really felt like we needed to revision who we were as a church and what God was calling us to. So we did that, and that was a bigger process. But part of that, we all agreed, was to become an affirming church, including welcoming LGBTQ people into leadership. So we actually, in the end, voted on the whole vision as a package, including becoming affirming. And that vote at that point actually sailed through. It was everyone voted in favor except for 2 people who chose to abstain because they didn't agree on biblical grounds. So it was a huge relief. I think John said that kind of the overwhelming feeling afterwards is just relief. It's been a long process. It's exhausting. There was all this awful conflict, but just so amazing to get to that point. So that was kind of the end of our official journey to become affirming. But I have to say, it was really the beginning the journey of learning more about how to effectively minister to and with LGBTQ people. And since then, we've learned a lot more about being trans and non-binary. We've asked people, what do we need to do to make our church safe in those ways? We've changed our washroom signage, things like that. So the journey is ongoing. Like, there's so much more to learn, and we know, like, we don't have it all together. We've got so much more to learn. So I think I just want to end. Dave asked us to kind of share some of the impact of our process, and I could share tons of kind of cool stories, but I'll just limit it to a few. A few weeks after we became affirming, a guy walked into our church who was just kind of full out, charismatic, gay, evangelical Christian, who was just so happy to find us. He actually already had what he called his gay church, where he was a leader as a gay person, but he was happy to find a place where he could be both gay and charismatic and just express the fullness of himself. And so it was such a blessing for him and for us. And he's become one of our key leaders in all kinds of ways. So that was a great story. More recently, we've had a gay couple come from a country where it's actually unsafe to be gay. They've been persecuted. They came as refugees. And just seeing them find a place for the first time where they could belong as a couple has just been so impacting. I think our youth were really impacted. A number of them had been negatively impacted by the decisions of some Christian camp organizations. They'd been really hurt by that. And it was Danforth was a place where they could process that pain, as well as explore their own sexuality. And a couple of our youth have come out at different points as queer in one way or another. So it really was important for them. And probably the most shocking story was a member who had been part of our community for decades, was in their 60s when we started this process. And all the way through, they were asking, why are we doing this? They didn't have a problem with it. They couldn't understand why we were doing it. But I guess it was impacting them at some level because they started to look at themselves. And then shortly after becoming affirming, they came out as gay, and then later as non-binary. And they became the most kind of radical of all of us in terms of really pushing us forward on those issues. So that was quite the shock and unpleasant surprise. And we're still having people come. Even since lockdown, we've had a couple of new people join us online. And again, they're just so happy to find a place that's evangelical, that's charismatic, where they can be their full selves and not be judged, just be accepted for who they are. So it just continues just to emphasize what a worthwhile process this has been, how much it impacts people's lives, like how right it is, how full of God it is, it's how full of love it is. I mean, it's been really hard for us, but I don't think we would change it for the world. It's just been an amazing process. And just being part of this and be able to share our story is, again, such a privilege. And so just really want to thank you, Dave, and thank you, The Gathering, for inviting us to be part of this, to share our story. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you. It's great to have an opportunity for us all to hear more of the story and to hear what we're beginning to see. I think are that there are some parallels with John's story and with what Cal's said, but some uniquenesses as well in the Danforth story. So thank you very much for being part of this. And we started on the East Coast. We're going to move all the way to the West Coast this time. And I would like to introduce you to Ann Smith, who is the pastor of the church at Southpoint in Surrey, BC. And Ann, see if I can find you. There you are. Perfect. Of the three churches that we're profiling here, the Southpoint is probably we're at the opposite end of this spectrum from First Halifax. That this is all a very recent kind of experience, I think, for you, isn't it, Ann? And we look forward to hearing a little bit more about your experience and the experience of the church at Southpoint.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here and see all your faces. Thanks for giving up this time. And I'm excited to tell what I see is an ongoing story of conversion. And yes, the sun rises in the east and slowly makes its way over to the west. So I humbly offer this story with the awareness that many of you are ahead of where we are, but I'm eager to tell it anyway. I went to an evangelical Christian college in the States. And after I graduated, the year after I graduated, I learned that a friend of mine at university had jumped in front of a train and killed himself. He couldn't reconcile how to be both gay and Christian. And in that moment, my heart shifted from what I had been taught, which was homosexuality is wrong, to conflicted and confused. And I knew that whatever belief reigned in my head, suddenly now compassion ruled my heart. And for the next 25 years, conflicted between head and heart, I dodged the question of what do I believe about same-sex relationships? I went to seminary. I went to Manila and pastored in an international church. I met my husband. We moved to England. I became a spiritual director. I taught spiritual formation. Then we moved to Kansas and I became a university chaplain. And in all those years, because LGBTQ Christians remain closeted, I was able to avoid this question. But I'm so grateful that in 2011, I was called to be the pastor of our little community in White Rock, church at Southpoint, and finally was forced once and for all to figure out for myself what I believed, along with my church. Now, this starts as a confession because when I was candidating for the pastoral position, the search committee told me that one of their founding members had come out as gay and got married, and they were in the church. And so now the leadership team was wrestling to figure out what to do in regards to their membership. And my response to that search committee was really quite cowardly. I said to them, it would be really lovely if you figured that out before I arrived. Still dodging the question. The questions were not answered by the time I arrived. Rather, the questions and conflict and confusion had deepened in that little community. And so I was, by default, responsible for walking a conflicted and confused church through a process while being conflicted and confused. For some time, the questions simmered in our leadership team meeting. Until one day I asked them, did you ever, before I arrived, invite this couple to a leadership team meeting and hear their story? And they said, no. So we invited this couple into a meeting just to listen. And we heard the story of a young man who had grown up, the son of a religious leader, who confessed his, quote, sin to his parents at 13, and then was sent around the country to multiple reparative therapy programs to, quote, fix him. And after, 10 plus years, he finally sensed God's Spirit saying to him, when will you see this doesn't come between us? My spiritual director's ears, peaked. Sensing God's loving care released him to find a safe place to be gay and Christian. And that led him to the Gay and Christian Network. And then that led him to finding his husband. As they shared their story with us, we wept together. We witnessed in them their love for God, their love for each other, and their love for us, because they who were on the margins were the ones who were reaching out and showing grace and patience to us. So moving from talking about a gay couple to talking with them was the first point in our conversion story. But there were a few other watershed moments along the way before we ever started a process with the wider church. And I want to name them because I think listening to the inner movement of the Spirit is a really important part of the process. We began the process under this false belief that we as leaders, it was our duty to stand in judgment over them to determine if their lifestyle was sin. And along the way, we shifted and realized that that didn't need to be our job. We needed to be their family who loved and support them. And we began to grasp the freedom in Jesus's commandment, don't judge, and begin honoring their soul freedom to discern for themselves what God's will might be. That was a radical conversion. We also realized that this couple would be part of God's family banquet table in heaven. So why would we keep them from being a part of our family banquet table on earth? After all, each week, don't we pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven? That was a shift. Finally, we realized what had been true all along. They already were part of us. They belonged. Why would we withhold membership from them? So it was these rationalizations that moved us from a rational paradigm of right versus wrong to a relational paradigm of inclusion versus exclusion. And we noticed that that was at the heart of Jesus's ministry. So these realizations took time to bubble to the surface, but once we were able to articulate them to one another, we could then articulate them to the wider church. We had a listening circle with our church community. It was a discernment practice. We, as leadership team, shared our desire to include these men into membership. We placed our Christ candle in the middle of the circle and asked everyone to share two things, their great hope and their great fear about doing this. We didn't debate or hold space for conversation. We simply listened to one another and the spirit in one another as an act of discernment. And as we did so, it became clear that we as a community were of one heart, that it seemed right to us and to the spirit to welcome them into membership. And so we did. And then later, a woman arrived who was lesbian, and we welcomed her into membership too. And then the men adopted a child, and we welcomed her too. And then parents and grandparents with queer kids began to arrive looking for a safe place for their hearts, and we welcomed them too. And so for years we lived this way. We had no clear statement of inclusion, just this desire to practice welcome. Eventually, some churches in Alberta caught wind of our practice and started a disciplinary action against us with the CBWC. I was called in to explain our practice of welcome. I said that we welcomed anyone who loved Jesus into membership, regardless of sexual orientation or gender identity. When pressed, however, I acknowledged we hadn't yet made any discernment about their place in leadership. Over time, this unanswered leadership question started to feel not so good to us. The middle way of welcome, which felt spacious at one point, now was starting to feel weak and insipid. And we sat in the discomfort of this tension for a few years, not knowing what to do next. But the catalyst for the final leg of our journey towards inclusion happened this fall, when the CBWC circulated a rough draft of their self-identity statement, which pastors and churches would be asked to support. And it included this statement that marriage was between a man and a woman. And this prompted us on our final process of self-identity to determine once and for all who we were and what we believed. And so this fall, we began that intentional multi-step process. We used the Welcoming Toolkit published by the Welcoming Institute, which was formed by the Gay and Lesbian Task Force. And it is a resource I highly recommend underscore. It's all laid out. It's so well resourced. Part of the process is to hold one-on-one conversations with every single person in the church. And this was vital because to be the whole people of God, we needed to hear and include everyone's voices. After we had done that, we crafted a sermon series around inclusion and made a series of weekly evening discussions around the questions that were raised in our one-on-one meetings, many of which we've talked about today, and I won't go over for sake of time. In the midst of this, though, we had more one-on-one conversations as new questions arose. At the end of that series, we did a survey to find out where people stood on the spectrum, from traditionalist on one end to being an ally on the other, and what kind of a statement, if any, they would be able to support. And it turns out that most people, primarily by living and worshiping alongside queer people, wanted our church to open up leadership, as well as bless and support their marriages. We had been changed by our practice of inclusion. Not everybody, not all the way, but we as a leadership team now had a mandate to form a statement. 72% of our church is now fully welcoming and affirming or an ally. Only 6 are now conflicted and confused, and 22 are welcoming and moving deeper into inclusion. So this past Wednesday, this is all fresh, very new, our leadership team approved a draft statement for distribution to our church community. And we ask that people sit and ponder it over the summer. And in the fall, we'll have another round of a listening circle. And hopefully, it is our deep hope that our vote will be completed this fall and we will be able to put that statement on our website. And we kind of want to go the full Monty, supporting and affirming gay marriage, leadership, and become menders of the net, working for reconciliation with the queer community. That's our hope. So it's taken us 10 years to get to this point. And in hindsight, it would have been more loving to our queer family members to do it a bit sooner. I know we have hurt them with our slowness, but we are finally, as a church, stepping out of our own closet. And it is a relief to know who we are and to have the courage to live out the affirmation and acceptance my queer friend did not find 30 years ago. And for me, this inner congruence is worth far more to me than the accreditation of a denominational body. So if anybody out there is on a similar journey and at a similar stage, I hope these stories give you courage. I think courage is contagious. There's lots of more detail I could share about our story, but I have learned that compassion did not cloud my vision, although so many years ago, but it actually cleared my vision. And I think we've been changed by this process. It's given us a much clearer understanding of the nature of God, a much wider appreciation for the beautiful diversity of the human species. And it's taught us that queer people are modeling for us what it looks like to live more whole and congruent lives. So those are some of the lessons we're learning on the way. Thanks for having me.
And thank you too for sharing your story and reminding us, I think, of some of the important elements in this journey. I want to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about why I'm here on this panel, and then I'm going to bring everybody back for a little bit of conversation. And I would just remind you that if you've got questions you'd like to ask, send them into our tech support person below. For me, as with everybody else, there's lots I could tell, but my journey in many ways begins in the 1990s when I think I really became what would now be called an ally of the LGBTQ community. But because of experiences I'd had, members of my congregation who had taught me some things, some important lessons along the way. And I remember trying to share that with some of my clergy colleagues and learning very quickly that it wasn't safe for me to do that. It was not acceptable to be accepting of queer folks and as a Baptist minister. So it wasn't until 2003, as I was in the midst of negotiating with a new church, a church that was new to me in Nova Scotia, and talking to the congregation, and I said to the leadership that I would like to have a conversation at some point about becoming potentially welcoming and affirming. And the church called me anyway, and I thought, okay, somewhere along the way, we're going to have this conversation. Very shortly after that, I heard about John Boyd's experience at Halifax. And in fact, I asked John if I could attend the sessions that they were holding in Halifax, and could I bring some of the leadership from the church I was serving? And John said yes. And that began our process in that church in the Annapolis Valley, that we began to slowly wrestle with this. And as with the other stories, it didn't happen quickly, it didn't happen overnight. It was quite a number of years before finally we came to a point where we were prepared to declare ourselves to be welcoming and affirming. We followed the lead in many ways of First Halifax and did some similar sessions. We also had some mentorship from some of the members of First Baptist Halifax who came alongside of us, who were giving leadership to the church I was serving. And we had that support from another congregation that had already been down this path ahead of us. And that support meant a tremendous amount to us. We also drew on some great support from the Association of Welcoming and Affirming Baptists in the US, and had some of their leadership come and spend a weekend with us at one point along the way. And that's another great resource that I offer up. And as with the other stories you've heard, it was costly. When we finally made a decision, we lost 3 or 4 families from the life of the church as a result, and that was deeply painful for us. And yet there was also new life and a new vibrancy and a freedom on the other side of that decision that was so important to us. Just as we were finishing that process, or kind of working towards the climax of that process, I suppose, in Nova Scotia, I was approached by some of the leadership of Burlington Baptist Church in Ontario, and they were beginning they were in the midst of a similar process. Little did I know then that they would eventually call me to be their minister. And since 2017, I've been here in Burlington. So it was a different experience coming here because this was a church that had already declared itself to be welcoming and affirming, and their call of me had something to do with that. But again, there was this sense of freedom and an opportunity to live into this new conviction that's been really quite wonderful. And again, here in Burlington, we continue to struggle with what does this mean? We've declared ourselves to be welcoming and affirming, but how do we live into that? How do we put flesh and bones on this framework of an accepting congregation that we've declared ourselves to be? Again, Burlington will tell stories about the cost and the loss that was experienced, but also the benefit and the growth that has come as a result of this. The fact that we declare ourselves to be a welcoming and affirming congregation does not mean that LGBTQ individuals are beating a path to our door. I would love to say that was the case, but we do have a trans woman who has joined us in recent time, and she tells the story about driving past our church for 2 years and reading our sign that said, "All are welcome," and reading our website that said we were inclusive and welcoming and affirming. And for 2 years, wondering if we really were honest about that. And it was 2 years before she finally came through the door with the courage to test what we were saying. I think it's really important for churches to get to that place where we declare our affirmation, our inclusiveness, but that in and of itself does not signal to the queer community that we are a safe place. It's going to take a lot more work before we get to that place. I want to welcome back John and Rachel and Anne. Oh, Anne, you were right there on my screen and then you disappeared. Where did you go? I'll find you. And I'm going to reach out to Leanne once again and ask if there are some questions that have come in for our panel. Oh, and you're on mute, Leanne. There we go.
Thanks. So I have, first of all, a question to Anne, and well, it's addressed to everyone, so all of the panelists, but I think this was actually a comment by Anne. What do you mean, or not Anne? No, Rachel maybe. Anyways, whoever wants to answer it. What do you mean by a charismatic church? I think that was you, Rachel.
Yeah, that was me. Sorry, I should have explained that. I guess at Danforth, we identify ourselves as a church that's kind of into the gifts of the Spirit, and, into the supernatural and healing and prophecy and all those kind of things. So that's what I meant by charismatic.
Okay, thank you. And to Anne, what kind of repercussions have you experienced on the denominational level because of your journey towards being affirming? That's from Erin.
So far, the only repercussion I've had is that I was invited to appear before the leadership team, and I was asked, kind of put on the spot and asked to defend myself and what we did, which wasn't a very comfortable situation. But I have not been, no formal disciplinary action has been taken, or no credentials have been removed. Although if the statement is approved, that is currently on the table in 2022, that might change. So we shall see.
Anyone else like to answer that question?
Well, I think I already alluded to the fact that there were personal repercussions as well as ones for the congregation. The same-sex marriage I did or led in 2011 involved the son of one of my divinity school classmates. The dad was the one who asked me to do the wedding. And when I asked him why he didn't feel he could do the wedding, and he said that he wouldn't be able to live through he was not a well man, but he would not be able to live through the controversy with the denomination. But he loved his son and he wanted to see his son married. It turned out that this young man's cousin was also a Baptist minister. I had not made the connection at the time, whose wife was chairing the Board of Ministerial Standards in Education, our regulatory body. So it only took seconds for the word to get back to those on high as to the wedding. And I got a letter, first a phone call, and then a letter from the then executive minister who wanted to know if I had conducted a same-sex marriage and that they would have to do an investigation, and then a copy of his charge against me that included the ironic description of I have seen a picture of the Reverend Boyd standing in front of the altar of First Baptist Church Halifax with two men in front of him, and it appeared to be a wedding. And therefore I accuse him of doing a same-sex marriage. Also, I have discovered that in the church bulletin and newsletter, congratulations were given to two people who appear to both be men, and this was the secondary. So that was kind of the tenor of that charge, and it never reached the point of a full investigation. I withdrew. As I said earlier, not wanting to stay on a list that required me to discriminate. And when I did write the letter asking my name to be taken off their list, I included a description of the wedding, which was one of the highlights of my life. And I then called them to repent, because I believe that whole attitude and way of being, or their understanding of being Christian, that so hurts our gay and lesbian, queer sisters and brothers, is sin and needs to be repented, and a new direction needs to be taken. And I don't think we should feel in any way that we are the ones who are being judged, that in some way we are doing wrong because we fall afoul of their regulations. I think we need to name what is happening, say it out loud, and ask for repentance.
Thank you, John.
Two quick comments, Lee. There are other credentialing options available for us in Canada now through the Canadian Association for Baptist Freedoms and through the Gathering. And that's certainly something that people should be aware of. The other thing I was just going to throw in was that the church I served in Nova Scotia, one of the things that people threw out as we were working through the process was, why are we doing this? This doesn't really affect us because nobody in our congregation is gay. Yeah. And about a month after we had made our declaration of inclusion, I was approached by a couple to do their wedding, and it was a trans same-sex couple. The one of whom was a grandchild of one of the families in the church, oldest families in the church. And so it did have something to do with this, but I was grateful that we'd worked through our process, so that at that point I was able to say, yes, let's talk about a wedding. not how do we begin a process of whether it's acceptable or not. So getting out ahead of this and not having this conversation focused on a particular individual or individuals in the life of a congregation, I think is really helpful.
Thank you.
Maybe I can just so can I just respond to the question about denominational retaliation?
Sure.
Yeah, for us, I guess what happened is that after we had our statement on our website, a number of churches did somehow find out about that and started to organize with the CBOQ to really kind of fight against that and to have us kicked out. So that's still a live issue. Things are ongoing. We have had conversations with some of the leaders at the CBOQ, one of whom in particular has been very supportive. So I think right now there's just a whole lot of conflict going on in our denomination, and it remains to be seen what will happen there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so for all of you, what do you say to queer folks who are part of a church that is not yet officially welcoming and affirming, but love their church, but also want to be part of a welcoming and affirming church and feel a lot of painful emotions when they think about having to wait for their church to become officially welcoming and affirming, especially when there's no guarantee?
I just think it's really important to start with really validating their reality and just saying that is such a painful place to be, and you have been on the margins and waiting for such a long time with no guarantee. And I wouldn't necessarily have an answer for them, because you know, we talk a lot. We've talked a lot at our church, particularly with this couple, about, we've used language of staying at the table. Like, can we hold on to each other and stay at the table and keep talking, even when we don't agree with one another, in the hopes that through that process there's movement and there's change. They would tell me a lot, just by sitting at the back, in the back pew of the church, we're changing the dynamic of the church, that our presence matters. And that's true, their presence mattered. But there comes a point when being at the table can be toxic to you. And so I think only that person, only a queer person can say, I can absorb that pain without it damaging me. So I'd probably help them think that through. And I think the same is true for pastors. Like, you know, John, it's interesting to me that you chose to turn in, you know, your credentials rather than wait to be kicked out. And I think that's a choice too. Like, how long can we stay in there without it hurting too much so that it's toxic? Or because there are once you align yourself, you begin to be excluded too. And then camaraderie and collegiality and a spot at the table, those things start being removed. So, I mean, so I think that there's a parallel process, but those are some things I might talk about.
Thank you very much. I'll throw in two quick ones. One, Paul says, does leaving the denomination lead to long-term issues for the denomination? And another denominational question, is there where did it go to? Are there any welcoming and affirming Baptist denominations in Canada? And the last question is the CABF and the Gathering of Baptists that both have the denominational standing to ordain.
That's a lot of questions, Leanne.
I know. So how about, does leaving the denomination lead to long-term issues for the denomination?
Well, we sort of did that is leave the denomination. All of these things were happening at the same time as something else, and the something else was that our denomination was incorporating under a new scheme and changing some of the basic ground rules of the way things had happened over really a couple of centuries. And and one aspect of that was that your church could be grandfathered into the new thing, but you had to take a vote to ask for that. And by the time we reached that point in the whole conversation, and the church had tried extremely hard to get changes made so that there would be room for diversity. And we were refused all the way along. And in the end, the church voted overwhelmingly not to join at this time. And as far as I know, that's where it's been left. But they did remain members of the Halifax Region Baptist Association in full standing. And that's not because the other churches in the association agreed with First Baptist and its stance, only that they agreed to be Baptist, in my opinion, to hold on to the relationship with us, even though they disagreed. So getting back exactly to the question that Leanne posed, we are hearing, I certainly personally heard from a lot of pastors a few years out, that they missed First Baptist, and they felt that the denomination was the loser.
Mhm.
And I still disagree with you, John. They'd start out that way, but it's not the same. And one encouraging thing is that over the last 6-7 months, we have had some, I say we, the Canadian Association for Baptist Freedoms have had some formal conversations with the convention leadership on matters where we overlap, because most of the congregations in Nova Scotia that belong to the CABF are also still members of the convention.
Mhm.
So there are overlapping issues.
Mhm.
Last thing I'll say is that we have ordained people through the CABF in our area.
Thank you.
Both
Thank you,
the
John.
Port Williams Church and First Baptist have ordained people under the CABF.
Okay. One last quick one. I usually have identified with the idea of changing the church's mind. With Anne and Rachel's stories, I hear more about changing a church's heart. Can you talk a bit more about head and heart in this transformations process?
That's such a good question. Rachel, do you want me to go first, or would you like to go first?
Go for it.
You know, I grew up thinking that logic was the most trustworthy source of truth and revelation, and I am becoming increasingly convinced that the integration of the head, heart, and spirit is the best way to discern truth. And that I've been wondering lately if even that emphasis on kind of our logical facilities might even be humbly offered a vestige of patriarchy in the church. And that by embracing our heart and spirit, we find deep wisdom. So there's the rational mind and the emotional mind, and then there's the wise mind, which is the wedding of both of those things. So I think it's a brilliant question, Cal. Thank you for asking it. It's also interesting looking at change theory that we can get so far with our head, but it's really our emotions that creates the resistance that keeps us from changing. So if you don't address those emotions, it's hard to move people along into change, which is why story or film has a tendency to transform us more quickly than just a logical argument. I really like that David Guthrie talks a lot about this, that you argue with people and they won't shift, but then they meet somebody and they shift. So those are some of my thinking around that. I offer up.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
Yeah, I think I would just add, I mean, we made a deliberate choice to start with the heart and not the head. And it impacts people so profoundly. It means they don't get stuck into their positions. I mean, I loved what Anne said about following compassion, and compassion didn't cloud her vision. Also what kind of Cal said about the experiential being so important. And I think for me, in the end, it just comes back to the way Jesus operated and taught people and ministered to people. And he didn't start with these, in fact, he never really got to any arguments. It was just all about the relationship, right? And so I think that's the model for us. So absolutely, both are important, but yeah, I think heart is just crucial. It's where people get touched and what produces the most change.
Thank you very much. Dave, over to you.
Leanne, I think I'm going to have to jump in here and wear my leader's hat here and draw this to a close. But I'm sorry, because I think we're getting to some really good stuff here, and I'd love to spend more time at it. When we put together the order for today, we envisioned trying something that I'm going to make an executive decision about, that we're going to let it go at this point. We thought it might be interesting to try to do a quick breakout where people would have a chance to actually interact with one another, because unfortunately, the Zoom platform, especially with this many people involved, is a very one-sided, passive kind of experience. And I think historically, as an organization in the gathering, the best stuff that happens at a gathering is the stuff that's not part of the program. It's the conversations at the coffee urn and just the relational stuff around the edges. And we thought maybe we could kind of build that in somehow, but I think we've simply run out of time. And I'm not sure that it would have worked very effectively on Zoom. Anyway, we'll see. As the chair of the program committee, we'll be looking at other ways for us to connect now that we're finding each other, and how to stay in touch and find meaningful ways to continue this conversation. But for now, I want to say thank you once again to John and to Rachel and to Anne for, again, not just sharing the information, but sharing so much of yourselves as part of this conversation. One of the great things for me has been to discover that I am not alone in this yearning for a much more inclusive and welcoming church, and a much more diverse church, one that looks more like a large box of crayons. And it's been wonderful to meet others who seem to harbor a similar vision for the church. So thank you once again for being a part of this today. I'm going to very soon move us to the final piece in our day. But just before I do that, I just want to say that we will be posting on our website the resources that each of the participants mentioned today, and as well as a few other things that we're aware of. But we're going to try to make that an active, ongoing list. So if you're looking for good resources for you and your congregation for this learning process, that will be one place that you can turn to and find those things. I want to just say again that the gathering is a community that began as just a place to hang out. That's where our name Gathering has come from. But we've had to become much more intentional about certain things, and one of those things is the credentialing process, so that we can now offer credentials for people who are looking for a place of accountability, but at the same time of community that they feel a part of. We will be having a fall gathering on October the 30th, and we are just in the process of crafting that, but we are calling it the Post-Pandemic Church. And we want to begin to think into how the church might intentionally be different in the post-pandemic period. We based that a little bit on a wonderful essay by Aaron Dottie Roy, who writes that the pandemic is a portal, and suggests that we have a choice as we cross through that portal as to what we take with us and what we leave behind, so that we can live into something new. We want to talk about that, and we'll be in touch with you all about that. And finally, I just want to say thank you again to Cal and to our panelists, to John and Rachel and Anne for giving of themselves and their time today. I want to say thank you to Leanne, our tech support, who has been busily working behind the scenes to make all of this happen. I want to say thank you to Kim, who is our registrar, and to our program committee, who have also helped to put things together for today. And finally, I want to invite you to stick around, because we have a brief but important business meeting that we need to conduct. Those who are members of the gathering, and if you are considering being a member, and membership has its advantages, of course, you might want to stick around and just check us out a little bit more. I want to wish all of you God's blessing as you continue to wrestle with this important topic, as you strive to become more faithful to the way of Jesus, as you strive to be inclusive and loving of our sisters and brothers everywhere. Blessings and peace be upon you. And I'm going to turn things over to Blake Eady, who is our moderator. Thank you again.